Welcome to Blooming Wildwood Homestead. Today I want to talk to you about two different methods for canning food at home, or home canning as it is often referred to. One of the things that people kind of think when they start thinking about food preservation is that they need to look at doing some canning and maybe getting started with that so that they can preserve their harvest from summer when the garden's in full glory through the winter time so that they can have food to eat throughout that time. When we look at canning, a few of my thoughts on it have kind of changed a little bit during the course of this year. I guess I hadn't really thought about when canning first came on the scene, and I thought that it had always been the way that homesteaders had preserved their food for years and years and years. And then this year we started doing a little bit of fermentation, and I was like, oh, there's this new method of preserving food, and it actually isn't the new method. Fermentation was the old way of doing things, and then we've gotten into the new method, which is to do canning. In 1810, there was a British gentleman who started introducing the idea of being able to can food in jars, and then by 1912 it was introduced into the United States, and there was the first commercial canning factory that was opened at that time, where people were starting to do that more and more. Now, throughout the course of those years since that time, canning has changed in the sense that we've become a lot more aware of what makes for good canning practice and what makes for potentially hazardous canning practice. Canning can be absolutely safe and a wonderful way to feed your family. But if it's not done properly or the proper techniques are not adhered to, it can cause you some problems and you can become ill from the food that you eat. Just like, even food that you buy from the store, if it's not handled properly or processed properly, it can cause you problems as well. Don't let that scare you. I just want you to be aware, as we're talking about the two different methods today, that's one of the reasons why we're talking about two different methods. You always want to make sure that you are canning in the safest way possible. So as you start to do a little bit more, I'd recommend getting your information first from trusted sources, whether that's the Ball books. They're one of the major canning companies, kind of have kept up on a lot of the latest research and things like that, or your local extension agency in your state. They're going to be able to update you as far as different times or different altitudes in your area, different things that you need to be watching out for when you're doing canning. So start with some trusted resources. Obviously, if there's someone that you are watching on YouTube that you trust to give you good information and advice, that's fine as well. But just make sure that it is a trusted resource, because ultimately your family's health and safety is of utmost importance. And if you're going to put the time into canning, it's better to get information up front to make sure that you're doing it in the safe and correct way, versus putting all the time into preparing your food, getting it in the jars, and then finding out, oh, I didn't process it correctly, and now I'm running the risk of potentially getting sick somewhere down the road if I eat that food. So we want to avoid those things and not even go there. The two methods of canning that we're talking about today are hot water bath canning and using the pressure cooker. So pressure canning rather. So we've got the hot water bath canner, and if you've watched any of my other videos, you know that I like to use the hot water bath canner that sits on the counter. I like the electric one just because it is a little more convenient for what I'm trying to do. I have a small area to work on the stove, and it's just nice to have this off of the stove and be in its own space. It also holds a few more jars than your traditional hot water bath canner, so I do like that. I will leave a link to that below in the description. But I do have a traditional style hot water bath canner that I just keep in reserve just in case. because you can use that on the stove. So if for some reason I was in the middle of canning something and the power went out for whatever reason, I can go ahead and continue on with my hot water bath canning and process the rest of that food, because I have one that will go on the stove and is not electricity dependent. So if you're gonna go with an electric one, you know, just keep that in mind. You might want to back up. And then the second method is the pressure canner, which I have here, and that does work on the stove, and you will want to make sure that it is there. Big question is, why would we need two different kinds of canning methods? And the thought behind that has to do with the acidity in food. If the food has a higher acidity, then it can be processed through hot water bath canning. If it has a lower acidity, then it's going to go into the pressure canner. If you're going through a recipe and you notice there are some jellies that are this way where they'll add some lemon juice to it, you don't want to skip that step. If you think, oh, I don't know if I really want lemon juice in with that berry jam that I'm making, don't skip that, because that's going to make sure that you've got the right acidity to be able to safely process in the hot water bath. Same thing with vinegar. So for example, last week I did some salsa, and the salsa recipe called for vinegar, which allowed me to have the acidity necessary to make sure that it was safe for hot water processing. Plus it just adds to the overall flavor, but you get the idea. Sometimes we add something to kind of build up that acidity. That's why your pickled items can go in hot water bath and you don't have any problem with that. Lower acidity items such as meats or beans, a lot of your vegetables that are lower acidity, those are gonna go in the pressure canner. What the pressure canner does is it's able to heat up to a higher temperature and process using steam, more of a steam method, okay? When I'm thinking about what kind of food I'm going to can, I want to think about which method is going to be the safe and appropriate way to can that food. Some people will refuse to do pressure canning because it makes them too nervous. If you have done any work, I think this is kind of changed over the past few years with the Instant Pot. If you've done any work with an Instant Pot, you're using a pressure cooker, which works under a similar pretense as the pressure canner. It's using that steam and built up pressure to cook or heat or process something in order to make it edible or safe, whatever the case might be. So if you've previously been nervous about doing pressure canning because you were worried about if you were gonna blow something up or if the top was just gonna pop off, just know that you want to make sure that you're doing it appropriately and you're watching it very, very closely. But if you've used an Instant Pot, you can use a pressure canner, okay? It just has to be watched. So you're not going to mark your pressure canner for the time that it needs and then walk away and do something else. You need to be in the kitchen, keeping an eye on it, making sure that it's staying at the correct pressure on the gauge, and you'll be fine. Where people run into problems is the same way that they run into problems with all cooking accidents or all kitchen accidents. It's when they walk away from something that's on the burner and they forget about it and they don't pay attention to it, and then it causes a major problem. To explain even a little bit more, on the pressure canner, you're going to see a pressure gauge. This gauge tells you how many pounds of pressure have been built up inside of your canner. In order to do things safely, different types of foods require different types of pressure for different amounts of time. So for example, I think, and don't quote me on this because it's been a long time since I've done it, but when I was canning tuna, it always had to go in the pressure canner. And if I'm not mistaken, it was like 11 pounds of pressure, and I think it had to be processed for 75 minutes. Again, don't quote me on that. I think it was at least that long, maybe even longer. I can't remember for sure, which is why I would look that up if I were doing that today. So let's just assume for right now that that was the case. Well, then I'm going to have to watch my dial and make sure that it stays at the 10 pounds of pressure and that it is held steady there for the amount of time appropriate. If you're not watching that, then the pressure can get too high and that's where you run into trouble. So don't be scared by a pressure canner. You want to develop out that skill in order to be able to process all of the food from your garden. If you're just getting started with pressure canning, I would recommend finding something that doesn't have to cook for as long of a period of time. Find something that can be held for a shorter period of time and start with that first, just to gain your comfort with that. And then you can move on and expand it a little bit more as you become more comfortable with the canner and the process of going through that. Okay, so pressure canning for low acidity foods such as meat and many vegetables, probably most vegetables. Hot water bath canning for higher acidity foods such as jellies, jams, any type of items with vinegar or lemon juice added to them, things that are going to be higher acidity naturally. With hot water canning, you're not doing any type of crazy stuff. You're bringing it to a boil and you let it boil for the appropriate amount of time. You take the jars out and then that's done. So not that you are going to walk away from that, but it doesn't require quite as much super close monitoring as the pressure canning does. Those are the two forms of canning, and I hope today this was helpful to you. Maybe you learned a couple of things and maybe you're a little less nervous to go ahead and try that. If today's video was helpful, please click the like button, and of course be sure to subscribe so you never miss another video from me, and I can't wait to see you back here in the next one. Bye everyone.